Okay.
Hello, all, and welcome to the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Coolbaugh. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Casey Berger. Casey, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How about you?
Oh, excellent. I find the more I do my intro, the more I screw it up. So I have to make sure I say it really, really slowly. It was great talking to you before we got recording. So like we talked about, we'll go ahead and start right in with that first question. What has your writing journey been like up until this point?
Yeah, so I feel like writing journey for me definitely encompasses my whole life, but I have a very unusual path to really whatever career you want to talk about. So I'm a physics teacher by day, physics professor by day, but I didn't start that way. So I actually, as a kid, I loved reading stories. I would write all sorts of stuff, just sort of, noodling around with things. It was a fun sort of playground, right? It's a great place to let your imagination run wild, right? And actually, when I went to college, I studied film and philosophy in my first degree. So I got trained, if you will, in screenwriting. So very classic Hollywood 3-act structure. I mean, that was very much my sort of story style or story structure from my college training. And I went and worked in Hollywood for a few years and ended up realizing that I missed math and science. I went back to school. But I never gave up writing. So during my PhD, I had written a draft of the book that became First Light before I started my PhD. And I realized, I had sort of the same realization, like, man, I miss storytelling. Now I'm doing all this science, which is great, but I miss storytelling. So I picked it up. I started revising it. I learned so much from the process of revising the book. And I ended up selling it. And I mean, again, I feel like this could go on forever because this is a whole lifetime of learning and experience, right?
Yeah.
So after selling the first book, then I had to write sequels, which was something I'd never done. So that was a really great sort of learning process. And the first book took 10 years to write, right? 10 years to write it, to revise it, to get it ready to sell. And then I had to write 2 books in 2 years. So I had to completely shift how I approached storytelling and how I approached writing. And now I had to think of it as a job, right? It wasn't just a hobby that I could pick up and drop whenever I wanted, right? I had to crack out books. So it's been a whole process, a lot of transitions. And I'm excited for all of the sort of the new things left to learn in the future.
Yeah. It's just so funny that you mentioned that, that gap. Like I was saying before we started recording, like Natalie Kuhn and I had talked about that. And she had said it was our first interview, how she had written like 26 drafts of Among Thieves. And I was like, well, I feel a lot better about myself right now with my first draft, taking like at least like a year and a half. And I don't really like it right now as I was fixing it. So I just think it's funny that you mentioned that. And the other thing I think is funny is every single author that we've had on so far for February, she wrote, has talked about that process of going from, except for CM Quinn, she's on her first book and now she's writing book 2 and 3. But even she talked about that transition from, book 1 to book 2. So I just was curious, what did you find the hardest thing about writing the sequel was? Because I know everybody always talks about that book 2 being really harder than book 1 even. So what was like the hardest thing you found for writing book 2?
Yeah, so book 2, I had to get a lot bigger with the world. I mean, book 1 was an introduction, but it was really just, you had to know enough of the world to follow the story and to sort of get hooked and get intrigued into what was going on. And then book 2, all of a sudden, and not to spoil too much from book 1, but there's this much bigger sort of world that you have to be aware of now. And so building my world I'd thought about it, right? I had some ideas of world building, but it's one thing to sort of have a general idea of what something is like, and another thing to like dive into that, so I have other civilizations that all of a sudden in book 2, we have a large part of the story set in another civilization. And I had to really figure out how to make all of that feel like it had all been there under the surface and fit with the plot, right? So like balancing, opening up this world in a much bigger way with still getting across the points that I wanted to get across in the book and not getting lost in the world building. That was a huge challenge for sure.
Yeah, I feel like it's really difficult. Like I had talked to a couple of people like recently, in particular for February, she wrote, and I was trying to think of that same thing where it kind of they like the female authors I talked to, they kind of changed my thinking of writing book one, because I'm like, well, if I'm going to write book one and then want to do a trilogy for her, I'm like, I might as well just add some of these things in. So it's just interesting to hear how people have done that with their world building, because I do agree with you. I think you can get easily lost, because I thought of it, I was like, well, the wider world is this, and if we go out of this city where, you know, book one is based, I'm like, where do you go? And it's just so interesting to see different people's approaches to, you know, trying to make the world bigger, but not too massive where it's like you have to reel it in.
Yeah. And so you said something earlier about like, you know, feeling maybe a little ambivalent about a draft of your book, right? And being at this point where you're just like, I don't know if I like this. And I felt like in book one, it was so easy for me to be like, well, I'm new, like, it's fine. I'm brand new to this. I've been writing all my whole life, but this is my first like real novel that I'm going to finish and do something with. And then in book two, when you get to that point where you're like, man, I don't like this. But now you can't be like, well, this is my first book. You have to say like, this is part of the process. And the fact that I don't like this means something is not working. And instead of just being sad about it, I need to think like, okay, what is this thing that's bothering me and how do I fix it? And like, you have to be a lot more willing to sort of accept that discomfort as part of the process, which is really hard to do.
No, I totally agree. And I know he wouldn't want it if I mentioned his name, but a friend of mine, another author who has given me a lot of personal advice through private messages on Twitter, you know, and we've talked a couple other times. I've been trying to get him on the podcast, but he talked about that. He was like, Dan, he's like, if you hate your draft by now, he goes, but you have to keep going back to that book. He's like, now you're an author. And I was like, and I didn't understand until just the last couple of, you know, once I finished like the last couple of weeks, and I'm like, because I thought, oh, I'm just gonna let it sit in a drawer, go and do something else. Now I know what I'm doing more, it'll be easier. But I just thought, and he just kept, you know, resonating in my head with that, and I'm like, I think he's right though. And it's funny how many people have brought that up in their own podcasts. I've seen a lot of blogs about that recently and things like that. So yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. Yeah, I think it's just one of those baptisms of fire, if you will, for book one, I guess.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of that like transition from being a hobbyist writer to being an author, right? You know, it doesn't have to do with whether you've sold a book or how many books you've sold or whether you have an agent. It really has to do with, can you get to that point where you're uncomfortable with your writing, but you don't give up, right? You use that to grow, you use that to sort of get better, and like being able to stare down a draft that you hate and like think about it in a sort of clear-eyed way is really hard. And I think that's really what makes someone an author.
yeah, no, totally. And I like how you put that. I think you're just totally right with that point that, yeah, like it's like a couple people told me recently, like, there's just like, they said that like, that's just something you have to do. And it's funny because I talked to Mallory about this with like Brandon Sanderson in our second interview, where Brandon Sanderson had written like 13 novels, but he had never sold one. And it wasn't until he actually fixed his novel, one of them, that he actually sold it. And I just think it's funny because I'm like, well, I guess I can't go and just write another novel, because, you know, if one of the best of our generation is, you know, said like, that's not, he wishes he had went back and just wrote a couple books, like 2 books, and, you know, went back and fixed their drafts. And I just stare at mine. I'm like, I know, I need to fix you. But yeah, that's funny. Yeah, but I think that's great advice. I think a lot of people will, you know, I want people to think about writing draft one differently. And yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think just not giving up and, you know, just finding the joy in continuing to fix that draft until you get that story is important.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm really interested in the second question. So what is it about science fiction that you enjoy writing the most?
Yeah. So science fiction, you know, I think as a physicist, a lot of people expect me to say, oh, I love the science. Because I do. I love science, right? I mean, it's my job. But for me, what I love about science fiction, which I think translates to all speculative fiction, so especially I'm thinking science fiction and fantasy, is that there's so much freedom to just explore without being trapped by, you know, this is what's possible here and now. It really lets you sort of branch out, and it makes the world so ripe for allegory and for metaphor that you can really just sort of dig into things in ways that are not, they're not going to be directly recognizable to the readers, but they're going to kind of work in the subconscious, right? So I think it provides such a great opportunity to tell really deep stories in ways that maybe are a little surprising.
No, I totally agree with you. I guess I always go back to, well, I really like in two different ways. Um I talked to Jennifer Swift about this, like Star Wars and Star Trek for two very different reasons. And I think that's why those two fandoms are some of the biggest. And Warhammer, I think, would be another one with the games and the books. There's just something about science fiction for me that's like, I do agree with you. There's so much you can do. And I actually just got done talking to Richard Lee Byers about this, because he's writing, him and Anna Stevens have both written for Marvel recently, for books with Asgard. So he's on book 2 right now, and I think she's just coming out with her book 2. But it's interesting that they said they're like, well, it's a mix between fantasy and science fiction. And I had talked to a couple of people who are really into science fiction, and for me, that's really interesting, because I guess I had never really considered it, because they kind of went with the point that, like, really, like if you look at ancient peoples, like what you consider science, they consider magic and and anatomy and things like that. And I'm like, that's true, and I don't know, they kind of made me think of science fiction in a different light, because really, there's just so much out there I feel like we don't know. And I love reading about just different planets, or the solar system. And I just think that there's so many cool things with science, where it's like, there's all the times I'm like, oh, that'd be a really cool story, and it's like, I just feel like it's so ripe. And that feels why people keep coming back to the genre personally, or things that it's like, what are the possibilities, when you look up and it's like they're all right there. So for me, it's pretty cool to to think about that.
Yeah, I think that connection to like myth and this question of like, where do we separate something from magic and make it science, right?
Yeah.
And then with science fiction, you can kind of go the other way, and you can take something that's science and you can make it feel like magic. I think that this callback to those earliest questions of like, who are we? Why do we matter? Like those big questions, that curiosity is still very there in human nature, and science fiction and fantasy is a great way to sort of scratch that itch and ask questions without necessarily using science to answer them, but using, science fiction or fantasy to answer them instead.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I've been trying to raise awareness more for Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, because you think of, she's the original, and because she was, I believe I have to double check, but I believe she was, the original urban fantasy writer, or science fiction, and it's like, but I think a lot of people skip over that she's the original urban fantasy writer. Not only skipping her for science fiction, but also urban fantasy. And if you really look at that book, and really dissect those things, that's what she's doing though, right? Is she's trying to come up with those questions of, why are we afraid of the dark? What is our survival about? Where does life actually come from? Can we actually learn how to create life in a different way? Other than just, giving birth and things like that. And for her to be a woman and to come up with that story, like being able to have a child, but coming up with, those different questions and trying to solve them in a story, I think made that story and those characters come to life more. And my buddy actually just wrote a paper on this. We both agree that he did a lot of research into the psychology. He said, I think if a man wrote that, it wouldn't be nearly as good, because, like she really had that connection with, just, I think, with like that question of, how do you give life in different ways other than just giving birth? And to me, that was just so interesting when he pointed it out. And I'm like, it just made me think of that whole book in a whole different light. And I'm like, how did you come up with that story? Like, that's what I really want to know. And a lot of people always talk about like Lord Byron or something, and her, I'm like, no, that was her story. And it always makes me, I want to have like dinner with her, and like be like, how did you do that? Like, just write notes. And yeah, like, cause you completely come up with a new genre. It's like, especially at that time, if you look historically, it's like, it's crazy to think about. But I do agree with you. It's like, I feel like she was trying to answer, those basic questions with a science fiction story, which I think is really, really cool.
Yeah, well, and Frankenstein too. I mean, it blurs those genre lines, which now we've really, like, when you go into a bookstore, it's like, the science fiction and the fantasy and the horror. Those are 3 different sections, and they're usually together in some way.
Yeah.
Right? But Frankenstein is all of those things, right? It's speculative fiction, right? It's this really sort of open like playground of, okay, so I want to ask this question about what what is this responsibility that we have when we give life, right? When we create life, what does this power mean in terms of its consequences? And she just took it and ran with it. And it's, it's a really, really exceptional story.
Well, it's crazy to think even, like with like cloning and, even like stem cell research and just different things that we're able to do now. And it's like, to think that somebody like, and Edgar Rice Burroughs is one of those people too, where I'm like, how did you know some of those things and, are going to happen? You know what I mean? Like H.G. Wells, it's like, it's just weird, and it's cool to think that, some of the things that writers like you are writing now might actually be reality in the future in 400 years, like they might be looking back at your book and being like, wow, how did Casey know that about us? Like, it's kind of cool to think
pure
about.
Random luck. It would have to be pure random luck. I can't imagine predicting that far in the future.
It's crazy when you think about it though, right? Because these people did. So for me, it's just cool because it's like, I feel like with science fiction, there is this, this timekeeper sort of aspect, where it's just because it's crazy how many times you look at a science fiction writer and, and then, look at what they think is science fiction and then, it really does come into reality, like cell phones, computers, just different things, and my friend this is not mine, this is my friend who made a good point. He's like, what if some of these science fiction authors are, are actually predicting like these ones did, what's going to happen in the next 100 years? I'm like, that's pretty cool to think about. So
well, I think so. One of the interesting things to me about that is I think it shows that science is actually a very creative field.
Yeah.
Because it's not that science fiction writers necessarily are tuned into something that's like something about the future. It's more that they're tuned into what people want and what people are interested in. And that this imagination that maybe originates in science fiction or not originates, that we see in science fiction actually originates just in the human mind. And we're seeing it totally differently in science as invention. So I think it's, I think that those threads are a lot closer together than most people think.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. And I just personally think that, people, for instance, like in your field, I think there's so many people I know where it's like, I think they don't get a lot of credit because they're scientists with being creative. And I'm thinking like, and a mathematician too, I'm like, you have to be so creative to think of these problems in different ways and how to solve them. I'm like, and I know so many scientists personally who are artists, who are sculptors, who are writers, who are journalists, who just do so many cool things. And I'm like, I think you have to be a creative person to be a scientist. And I just think a lot of people think it's in different fields. And I'm like, it really makes me question like logic. I'm like, really? Like, I just feel like you can't just be smart. You have to be creative, and I don't know. It's just, I totally agree with you. I think that you have to be, creative to be in your field. And I just don't see any other way around saying it. Like, you have to be. I mean, otherwise you're not going to discover anything or, help improve, because that's science, right? It's like trying to help improve the environment or our lives. It's like, if you're not creative, how are you going to be able to solve a problem? It's like step one in the process is coming up with a hypothesis, right? It's like, if you're not creative, how are you going to come up with a solution to that problem? It doesn't make sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I totally agree with you. That's a great insight right there. That's awesome. So now we get to your job. So I was really interested when I first saw your books pop up on Goodreads because I had seen your profile. So how has your job influenced the type of science fiction that you write?
Yeah, so I mean, part of me wants to say, well, it hasn't, because I wrote First Light before I went back to school, and so I wasn't a physicist yet, right?
Yeah.
But I think that is not the full truth. It's sort of an incomplete explanation. So I think that what drives me as a writer and what drives me as a scientist is sort of the same thing. And we've already kind of touched on this idea of curiosity, of asking these sort of deep questions, but answering them in completely different ways. And I think that the sci-fi that I write really likes to ask these questions about sort of what is real, how do things work? So a really common, or not common, but a really deep thread and a really frequently occurring theme in the Resonance Saga is this question about fate. And, are we fated to be a certain way is it sort of like going back to my philosophy background, is, you know, is it a deterministic universe or not, right? Are we able to make conscious decisions and break free of old sort of patterns, or is everything predetermined? And that's a question that's really deep in quantum mechanics as well. So a lot of so my research is in computational quantum mechanics, and a lot of those questions arise through quantum mechanics, because the mathematical description of it is entirely to do with probabilities, right? I shouldn't say entirely, that's a very, very big word, but the way that we describe the behavior of quantum particles is through probability. And so this inherently raises this question of, you know, is this deterministic, or is it random? Can, you know, the classical physics world is very causal, right? So A happens and that leads to B and then C. And quantum mechanics is not as clear. And so I think a lot of these same questions sort of show up both in my research and in my writing. But I wouldn't say that, you know, as a physicist, I'm naturally going to write certain kinds of sci-fi, but I think as a person who's interested in particular questions, those are going to arise. Everything I touch is going to have these questions in it somehow.
Oh, that's cool. I think that's a terrific answer. And I always like asking people that, because it seems like a pretty mundane question, but I find that authors always answer it in a very unique way. And I've never gotten the same answer twice, not even remotely. So, but that's really cool. I think you bring up, you know, a really interesting aspect. And it's one reason why I do this channel, is to learn from, you know, what everybody has to say and how you think, to kind of think about how I think. And, you know, I'm a martial artist, so it's like, you know, you get, like, the other day I did something and I was like, why did that take me like 15 years to figure out? And it doesn't even seem like it's a hard thing, but, you know, all of a sudden you understand this concept. And my instructor looked at me like, oh, you got it, you know, and I just thought it was interesting. So when you say that to me really makes me think different about why I write certain things that I write. So yeah, I really like that answer. It really has me thinking now. And I think it'll have a lot of audience, you know, people thinking the same, is like, why do I write these things? You know, because I do write, you know, I write fantasy, so and urban fantasy and things like that. And I think I use a lot of history because it's what I know, it's what I enjoy. But I guess I always wonder why. So now you have me thinking more like, why do I write certain characters or certain situations that way? But yeah, that's a great answer. You're gonna be thinking about that all night now.
It's good. I did my job as a writer and a professor.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Make people think.
I was gonna say, if I had classes like yours, I'd probably be doing more science fiction. So, so for that fourth one, so what subgenre of science fiction do you enjoy writing the most, and why is that your favorite?
Yeah, so I will have to take the cop-out answer here and say I don't have a favorite.
Cool.
The Resonance Saga is space opera, which was really fun to write. And I think one of the powers of space opera is its flexibility, that it can be any kind of story just set in space. So I really liked that about space opera. But the novel that I'm working on now is actually near future hard sci-fi.
Cool.
And I think a lot of the reason I'm open to exploring any subgenre of speculative fiction is that the story that I'm trying to tell is going to be different in different environments, right? So the story that I'm trying to tell now wouldn't work as well in a space opera setting. I could probably tell it, but it would lose a lot of its power, I think, if it wasn't set in a near future world. So those questions of fit, you know, where does this story belong? You can say the same thing about characters, right? So who should be telling this story? Who needs to be embodying this character arc? Those are the really fun parts for me about the early parts of writing a book, right? The brainstorming, the outlining is figuring out, you know, the who, the what, and the when. For the why, I think I start with the why, and the rest of the pieces have to fit the question that I'm asking. So I don't have a favorite. I really don't.
No, that's a great answer. And I always tease my friends about this, because I'm like, you say that you like this one, but then I'm like, really, people say that your subgenre is really this. It's just always funny. But you mentioned something amazing though, that you start with the why. And I think personally, I find that very difficult for myself, And I've talked to some authors recently who said the same thing. Like, I think because I'm trying to be more of a planner, but I usually like, I'm an exploratory writer, and it's like, but I'm trying to be more of a planner, because you could write for years, which I've done for 14 years and not accomplish anything. So I'm trying to plan more. But like, I like how you mentioned that, because I found that I have trouble with the why, and I come up with the why as I'm going. I have these characters who are doing these things, and as I'm writing, that's one thing that I discover is the why. So I do find that interesting, your comment there that you have the why first. And I do think that's an important thing to point out to the audience, that I personally feel like if you have the why, you should go with the why, because my way is not efficient, and I'm trying to get better at that. But I do find it interesting that you mentioned that. So that to me it's always funny when people say things like that, because I think about that constantly, and I'm like, how do I get myself, there for the why? So would you say that that's like a natural thing, that you just naturally start with the why, or did you have to work at that at all? Or
So I think the way I said it made it sound way simpler than it is, which is that I start with the why, but right. Yeah. It's so easy to like say something in a sentence, and then actually it's, really you could write a whole novel about that one sentence.
Totally.
But I think I always start with a question, but I maybe can't articulate the question yet. And so I'm part discovery writer, part planner. And I find that I can usually figure out enough of my question that I want to ask to start writing something. And then I can, as I write, I figure out, okay, no, this is how it all fits. This is the question I'm really trying to get at. And then from that, I can plan out the book, and then I can write it. But I think that whatever your entry into the story is completely valid, that different people have different story seeds, and whatever process works for you, whatever it is that gets you excited, using the general you, right? You specifically, but also anyone who wants to write, whatever gets you excited should be what you start with, because that motivation is so important. And then you can flesh out the rest of it later, and you can kind of fill in all the other details. But maybe for someone it's the who, right? They have a character really, really well imagined in their head, and they know exactly who this person is. And then they have to design a story around that person. Or maybe it's a plot set piece that they know they want to write about, and they have to figure out, okay, well, who needs to be here in order for the set piece to happen? So I don't think you have to feel like you have to start with the why. Start with whatever is exciting, and then find all of the other pieces that fit with that piece that you're excited about, and go from there.
No, I just think that's terrific advice. And by the way, I would call you more of a gray Jedi there, right? Because you do some outlining and discovery. So you heard it here first, folks. Okay, Casey Berger is a gray Jedi when it comes to planning or discovery writing. But I just find it interesting you say it, because I had read somebody's blog post recently. I feel really bad because I can't remember, because I read too many in a week, but it was brilliant. And they talked about how every writer's like on the outside of a swimming pool, and no matter if you go in the shallow end or halfway or the deep end or the diving board, everybody gets into the pool where they're comfortable, and then does their thing. So I really liked how you said that. I totally agree with you. I think really just I always tell my clients and my students that the first part's to start, right? And as soon as you get started, then you can figure it out. But yeah, I think that's terrific advice. All right. So if there was one science fiction, I stole this from a friend of mine because he asked me it the other day. So thank you, Dan Lerner. If there's one science fiction character from a book, story, or movie that you could go on an adventure with, who would it be and why?
This is a hard question.
I know, right? I was like, oh, Han Solo. Then I was like, no. And then I was like, I went to Jean-Luc Picard, and I was all over the place. So I didn't really come up with an answer. So
yeah. So I think part of the difficulty for me is I don't feel like very much of an adventurer. So,
well, that's why they come and get you, right? That'd be a great book. Like they come and get you, and then they take you off and into their spaceship or whatever, like The Last Starfighter or something. Like
yeah. I feel like so, and there are so many characters I don't want to sit down and pick their brains, right? But I think if it came down to like who would I want at my side if I was on an adventure, there are two that I really I can't like decide between. So
give us two.
So Garrus Vakarian from the Mass Effect series.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, I feel like definitely someone you want by your side if trouble is happening, right? And good friend, loyal to the end, and always going to have a snarky comment to keep you entertained, right? So like if you're going to be on a long journey, like that's who you want by your side. So that was sort of the one that I kept coming back to. But another character that I would really love to see in action, and this may be a less well-known one for some, is Olivia Dunham from the Fringe series, which is a television series. Yeah.
Oh, that's a great series.
It's so good, right?
Very underrated.
I mean, yeah, talk about asking really deep questions. I mean, they do some subtle things in that show, really spectacularly. But I guess in a lot of ways, there's similarities to Garrus here. So maybe I'm coming up with some themes here, but she's she's hardworking. She will always see it through. She thinks on her feet, and she is just a good friend and just a good person. I think that's a big one for me, is like just having a big heart, and being someone who you would want to share the good and the bad with. So I think those are the two that I would most want to come on an adventure with me.
I think those are both really great answers. My friend asked me, and I was like, I just kept going from person to person. He's like, you can't do that. You have to pick. I was like, so I'm like trying to figure it out for a future episode. And I think I might expand on a little bit more and then ask the audience to get some feedback. But yeah, I think those are both great answers. Man, Fringe. I haven't thought about that show in a couple of years. My friend and I like blew through quite a few episodes like right off the bat, and then I didn't end up finishing, so I'm definitely gonna have to go back and do that now.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'm gonna just go right out there and say I think it's one of the best series finales of anything that I've ever watched on television. So
yeah, that's what I've heard.
So now I hope you like it, because otherwise I'm gonna be very sad.
We're gonna have to. My buddy and I, we're gonna have to once it's like springtime and COVID's hopefully calmed down again. We'll have to do that. Yeah. So now you put it back in my head. So I just got I'm trying to finish Sliders actually, and then a couple other ones. I'm almost done with a couple other sci-fi series from like Sci-Fi and stuff like that. But yeah, like one is I would like to get done with is like Eureka. I just feel like there's so many great sci-fi TV series to get caught up on. It's like, and now with streaming, I just feel like it's so much easier than tracking down DVDs and stuff like that. But yeah, Fringe is definitely one that I'm gonna have to finish up. There were just so many things that I had talked about with my friend from the show where it's like, I feel like it's very hard to pick a favorite episode for that show. And there's just so many. I do agree with there's a lot of nuances and things. And my friend's really great at science and has that understanding. So we'd watch the episode and then he'd explain it to me. And I'm like, oh, wow. And he's like, yeah, then there's this and that. And I think we just got halfway through like season 2 or something like that. And then we had to stop because of the pandemic. But yeah, I'm gonna have to go back. Our audience here, if you have not watched Fringe, just go and do it. And
go watch
don't
it.
Spoil the ending for me, okay? Because I'm kind of busy right now. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, those are two great people to go on an adventure with. I'm gonna have to really be thinking about that one now. Okay, so now I'm really excited for this question. Always asking people about what their books are about. So, what is your resonance? Now, is it a trilogy? I know there's 3.
Yes.
It's
a trilogy.
For saying, they're like, I'm not writing a trilogy. I'm writing 5 books. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I was like, I probably should have asked, but there were only 3 on Goodreads. So what is the Resonance Trilogy about?
Yeah, so the Resonance Trilogy starts as sort of I was saying earlier, space opera is like any kind of story in space. Well, this is political intrigue set in space. It's set in the far future Milky Way galaxy, 500 plus years from now. And so humans have made first contact, a century prior to the story. And so there's this, there are 3 galactic superpowers, the Secante Federation, the Narayan Empire, and the United Human Nations. So First Flight, the first book in the series, follows 3 people, one from each of these 3 superpowers. So from the Secante Federation, we have a scientist named Tynan, and Tynan's research has been stolen out from under him, and he's trying to get it back. From the Narayan Empire, we have Mara. Mara is a bounty hunter, and she is actually on the run from her own family. So Tynan is trying to get his research back. Mara's trying to run away. And then the third person is from the United Human Nations. It's Jaya. And Jaya is a naval intelligence officer. She lost her family in an attack on her home as a child. Her parents were killed and her brother was taken away, but she knows he's still alive. So she's trying to find him. And so these three people, their stories come together, their paths intersect, and they uncover a much deeper mystery about what's going on in the galaxy. And then the future books, Ursa Major and Dark Stars, which are the second and third book in the trilogy, sort of explore the consequences of this mystery they uncover. So I won't say much more than that to avoid spoilers. But, we talked a little bit about starting with the why. And so this story is very much a story about resilience and hope, even in the darkest of times. So that's the short version. You'll have to read them all to find out the long version.
Oh yeah, I'm excited. A buddy of mine who actually was sharing I think it was the trilogy the other day on Twitter, which is where I found your stuff after Goodreads. I was like, oh, that's cool. I just saw this pop up in my Goodreads. So I was like, okay, so I checked out First Light. So I was waiting to get my Kindle. So I'm almost done setting it up today. So I'm excited. Yeah, I think if anybody in the audience needs more than that, they really shouldn't be on this podcast. This is not the podcast you are looking for. Those characters sound awesome. I always personally like, stories are great, but I just think that, if I'm reading your blurb, and I really liked when I was reading your blurb what it said about the characters, and I was just like, okay, sold. My friend, he goes, because you really need to work more on how you're reading blurbs. I'm like, nope. I'm like, if I find it interesting, or, especially find the characters interesting, or you have a cool concept, I'm like, I'm there, especially for science fiction and fantasy. Maybe historical fiction, I need a little bit more. But yeah, I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. But I think you explained that really well. It was great. I think a lot of people get scared about, advertising the book, but they can just watch this podcast and see how you did it and make it really good, like a blurb. So yeah, that's awesome.
I will say it never feels easy. So for anyone who's out there like, oh, I don't know how to talk about my book, I was literally saying that 5 minutes ago. So it does not get easier. Sorry.
To be fair, Stephen King just said that the other day, 3 weeks ago. He said, he goes, I always find book blurbs the hardest. He goes, I can't ever figure out how to explain my book. And he said, I have written so many books. He goes, I always start a book and it feels like the first time. So I think we can all get rid of those notions that it's going to get any easier and just accept that, it's just going to be one of those things. But then again, that's why I write. Like a lot of people, there's a lot of authors in the world and writers, right? But how many people have actually, written a book? I feel like it's still very small. Like in my town the other day, I just met a horror writer who's writing his first novel, and like we just met randomly sitting at a counter waiting for it to go food and talked for like 20 minutes. And I just thought it was really cool because I'm like, in my town there's just not very many of us. I tried starting a Ithaca writers group or society, and it was me. I know there's other people, but there's only a couple science fiction and fantasy writers in town who have actually written or want to talk to people. So I feel like we're still the minority. But that's a great answer, though. I'm really excited to get First Light as soon as I can figure out my Kindle later today. It might be tomorrow. So who are some science fiction writers or authors, and it could be fantasy, it could be anybody. So who are some authors or writers that have inspired you to write?
When I was a kid, I was very much a fantasy reader, more than science fiction. I really didn't get into sci-fi until much later in life. But the people who really, I think, captured my imagination and made me want to do what they did, the one that stands out the most, that sort of stands the test of time and looking back, like I'm still in awe of, is the His Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman. That was sort of maybe one of the first times that I was just like, wow, like, books can really, and speculative books can change everything. So, and that's sort of, that's fantasy, but it sort of straddles science fiction and fantasy. I would say that's a genre bending series for sure.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. I also really loved Tamara Pierce and the Song of the Lioness series. So those were sort of my, as a kid, the books that I really was inspired by. As I got older and sort of really started thinking a lot more about why I care about science fiction and fantasy and why I'm so drawn to it. The authors who really inspire me and to this day are, on my list of people whose books I am obsessed with, are N.K. Jemisin, just absolutely phenomenal. Ursula Le Guin,
Oh,
just
heck yeah.
the master of the craft.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah. And Cameron Hurley. So those are the sort of three names that, like, as soon as something of theirs comes out, I'm gonna buy it. They blend just amazing character development with really fantastical worlds, and the prose is just top notch. And I mean, the kind of tough questions that they aren't afraid, they don't shy away from them, right? And that's what I love about their writing, and that's what continues to inspire and motivate me to do better at my own writing.
Yeah. Oh man, I tell you, the first time I discovered A Wizard of Earthsea, it blew my mind. I had to, like, I got it done, and then in like a night, and then I had to go find book 2, and then it was like the internet was just coming about, and it was like I couldn't, like, used bookstores were not really around very much in my town, and it was like having to order it. So I had to find book 3 just like randomly. I just reread them actually during the pandemic. I just think that I have a couple other words of her too. Like I like her and Ray Bradbury, and then Anne McCaffrey. I feel like with Dragon Riders of Pern, just they were some of the first like fantasy and science fiction books that I've read outside of Star Wars. And it really but yeah, Wizard of Earthsea just like opened my eyes to fantasy, and I'm really thankful to her, because then I read Tolkien, I read The Hobbit, and I just end up reading a lot more fantasy because of it, because I was really only reading science fiction before that, or like historical fiction. But yeah, that's a great list right there of authors. That's really awesome. Yeah, Ursula K. Le Guin's on mine. There's just so many people I know that have been inspired. Like, and it's crazy to think, right? My friend, he said, he was like, you got to think, like, how big are those books? Wizard of Earthsea.
Yeah.
Like, she did a lot. Yeah, she did a lot with that magic system in those tiny books, and some of her others aren't even that big. And to think of, the world she created and the ideas that, I just think I think if you look at a lot of people, that I've talked to over the years, it's just so funny how if there's one person on the list, I feel like she pops up more than anybody. But I totally understand.
Yeah, she can do more with a few words than anyone. I mean, she does it in a way that you don't notice it's happening until you're hooked. I remember reading for the first time Wizard of Earthsea and being like, oh, it's just like a story about a kid who is a mage, right? Like it's generic middle grade fantasy. And then about halfway through, I was just like, wow, like she's doing all of this stuff with the world and these big questions, and I was so hooked, and I didn't notice it happening until I was halfway through, and that was just like, wow, she's really exceptional.
I when I went and reread her during the pandemic, I think that's probably the 4th or 5th time I went through the first 3 books again. And I think I'm just holding off on book 4 because I just don't want Earthsea to end. But as a writer, studying her writing and just world building and things, I got done with book 3, and I was just like still astounded. I'm just like to feel the weight of the decisions and the characters. I'm just like, I was so mesmerized. I think even more, with now knowing more about writing and things. And, it's like, I feel like it's like, going to the Empire State Building as a kid, but then actually becoming an architect or engineer and knowing how they did it. It's just a lot different. And you just have a lot more, respect for the beauty and the craft. But yeah, I just always shake my head. I'm like, I wish we had, there's other books of hers. I'm really piecemealing them, so I don't just finish. Ray Bradbury is another one I'm trying to do that with, because I feel like once I've read all of their books, it's like that magic's kind of gone a little bit for me. So I'm really trying to wait a little bit. But
I think that's really funny that you said that, especially considering some of the themes of Earthsea. I feel like maybe you should just read it all the way through.
That's fair. My friend said that. I said, well, here's my thing though. I said, when I get to book 4, I said, I have absolutely no problem going through them all again in order. And I actually plan on doing that with my friend from book club, because he's never read Wizard of Earthsea. And I'm like, dude, I'm like, we're reading Malazan Book of the Fallen right now, with both Erickson and Ian Esselman's books. We're loving them, but I told him, I'm like, if you like these, I'm like, we really gotta, get you into some some key people for the genre. He's read like George R.R. Martin and some other people, but he's like, who's Ursula K. Le Guin? And I was like, I got this. I was like, I got this. So I'm about to buy him a set. So I hope he's not watching this. I'm about to buy him a set of all 4 books. So I'm really hoping this summer we can just kind of go through quick. But yeah, I know it's got to end at some point, but I was hoping it kind of be like the never ending story and never really end, but got to at some point. All right. Well, you had a lot of really great things to say. So I really appreciate you coming. For that last question there, do you have any promos, news, updates, new projects, things like that you'd like to promote before we get done?
Yeah, so the new projects are all a little too new to talk about. So you'll have to keep your eyes peeled for that. But my website, so caseybergerbooks.com, you can sign up for my newsletter. You can, when you sign up for my newsletter, you'll get access to the secret library, which has a bunch of excerpts and short stories. And being a newsletter subscriber, I only send quarterly newsletters, so I won't flood your inbox, but you will be the first to know things and get early access to some of those like short stories. So right now it's all stuff set in the Resonance universe. So if you want more backstory and more, sort of side quest type stuff, it's all on there. So caseybergerbooks.com.
Awesome. Well, as usual for our audience, I will be putting Casey's website in the description for everywhere that this podcast is found, along with other places that you can find her books, Goodreads profiles, things like that. You guys in the audience know I like to throw everything that author has in those descriptions. That way you guys can go right there and find any Casey's websites and get to her books a lot more easily. I know sometimes people are kind of like, oh, I have to go and find this person. So I try to make it as easy as possible. I'm like that too. That's why I just use Twitter and I just click on everybody's profile and go right to their books. But again, really want to thank you for coming on, Casey. I feel like I learned a lot from this conversation, and please, when you have your next project, ready to go, please, think of us, and we'd love to help you, with the promoting of that, that next project, book, whatever it may be. Really look forward to, seeing what you have in the future for that project. That sounds really cool. In the meantime, I know myself and the audience will be, checking out the Resonance Trilogy and seeing what those 3 books are about. You have me really intrigued with those characters. So I'm definitely excited to read personally. So again, our audience, you can find us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on Spotify. We're hoping by the time that this is out, this interview with Casey, that we can have the website up and running. I know we're going to be working really hard on that the next couple of weeks here in January. So we're hoping by February 1st that is up and running. So you would actually be able to go right to Casey's profile on the show, or on the link for the show on our website, and you'll be able to go down to this episode. Again, all the descriptions for those author profiles will be right there for their websites, things like that. Everything's tried to make so you guys can find their books very easily. Again, Casey, thank you so much for coming on. Really look forward to talking to you in the future on Twitter and social media. And again, like I said, hopefully we can have you back really soon. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a pleasure.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. Anytime you want to come on and talk about fantasy, sci-fi, or teach us anything about science, like, feel free. I feel like myself and a lot of people that want to write science fiction probably need it. So we could call it like Casey's Corner or something like that and go from there. So
sounds like fun.
Awesome. We have a great rest of the Sunday, and I will talk to you again soon, my friend.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Thanks, bye.